Hello and welcome again. It's Nathan with another GrandStream tutorial. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most common issues I see, especially when I'm taking calls in the call queue, and it's regarding NAT, or Network Address Translation. And how do you determine if you're in a NAT situation? Well, if your UCM has a local IP address behind a router, you are technically NATed. And where you can start running into problems is some routers aren't really good at keeping certain ports open for certain end devices, obviously for security reasons. So if you ever had an instance where you'd set up a UCM, you got everything going, your VoIP trunk's registered, you make a call, it drops after 30 seconds, or when you're on a call as well, you get one-way audio. Usually those two methods I use to determine if someone has natting issues. Basically what's happening is our UCM is sending out the wrong IP address information. It's trying to send its local address to your VoIP provider that's on the public, which at that point it's an unroutable number for them. So that leads to the one-way audio. When they acknowledge that we send the invite with the 200 OK and they send us that 200 OK, they're actually trying to send it to our local IP instead of our public, and that's where you get in the call disconnection after 30 seconds and so forth. So if this sounds like you, definitely stay tuned. You have the benefit of this video of both the 2-in-1 video. We're actually going to be doing port forwarding on our GWN 7000, and we're not technically going to be using port forwarding. It does have port forwarding, but I'm going to go the extra step and show you how to do DNAT rules, which will include source address filters on there, which helps for security. And I do recommend that if you are going to be doing port forwarding on a router, make sure you have some type of security there. You can't just openly start port forwarding to the UCM, because then that's when you get a lot of scammers sniffing for those 50-60 ports, especially if you set it default. That's something I don't recommend, but I'm going to walk you through on how I like this set up in a very secure manner. You could change your RTP range. I'm not going to do that. Some people like to shorten it from 10,000 to 20,000 to maybe 10,000 through 11. That's completely fine. I'm not going to do that. But you can consider that if you want to add extra security. The more ports, or the less ports you have opened up, the more secure you are. But in general, I don't tend to worry too much about RTP and the way we do audio, because we'll open up random ports. And sometimes it's not even necessary to open up the RTP range either on certain routers. They're pretty intelligent in how they open and keep connections open. But in general, you will have to open them up on certain routers. But beyond that, let's go ahead, let's dive in, and let's get into what we need first in order to set up our UCM that's behind the NAT. Starting off, I do have a SIP trunk in here. It is a flow route SIP trunk. You could use any SIP trunk for the most part for this. It's just flow route is something I have available for me to test. With that being said, I know what their IP address ranges are. For security reasons, I could then whitelist, so I'll show you how I'm going to do that in a little bit. But first off, on your VoIP trunk, you want to make sure that you have NAT checked. If this is not checked, you want to make sure that it is checked. This is telling the UCM that if you're going to be contacting this VoIP trunk, you are being NATed here. So you're making the UCM aware of that condition. Next thing that we have to do is actually go to our PBX settings, SIP settings, and click on NAT. Now, this is all you really have to do to get yourself going, but you have to know what you have to input into these values. So I'm going to explain them first. External host is going to be your public IP. Now, this will be further complicated if you don't have a static IP. Fortunately for myself, I have one. If you don't worry. We can still work with that using DNS, which is something I'm going to have to do for another video. But all DIN DNS does is you're going to register with a provider that has DIN DNS service. You're going to say, hey, I need to use your service. They're going to give you a domain name that you can use. You're going to authenticate yourself with the username and password. At that point, your UCM will be pegging that DIN DNS service, constantly updating it to what its IP is at a certain point of time. So that's DIN DNS in a nutshell. I'm not going to show you how to set that up, but I will show you how to set it up on a static. So I'm going to go ahead and verify what my external host is. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, and on my GWN I can check that here. So I can see that my address is the 96.31.248.41 address. I'm going to go ahead and copy that for myself because I'm a little lazy in remembering stuff. And if you're dyslexic like me, you will get those numbers backwards from time to time. So I know what the public IP is. On the GWN, I'm actually going to include my forwarding rules in my advanced settings in DNAT section. This gives me the added benefit of doing both port forwarding and allows me to implement a security rule. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and add this information to my external host. So this is my public IP, and I'm going to do one more security step here. Now, by default, our signaling port for SIP is 5060. But there are times in which you might want to add an extra security layer, which is changing your public signaling port, which is a very common practice here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this 9000. Now, I wouldn't recommend using 9000, especially because I'm using this as an example in a tutorial video. But my external signaling port will be 9000, and I'll show you how we're going to implement that. Local network address. As you can see, I'm currently logged in as 192.168.100.103. That is the local IP I am getting from my GWN 7000. For this, I will actually be using the network identifier, not the actual IP. However, I have seen other engineers use the actual IP of the UCM. It seems to work fine, but for me, I just more comfortable with using the network identifier, and this is how we tend to do it per documentation. So I'm going to do a network identifier of 0. I know my subnet is going to be a /24. I'm going to go ahead and click add. Now, once all that is done, I'm going to save these changes. It will reboot the UCM. So in the time that it's rebooting, I'm actually going to do my DNAT rules or my port forwarding. As you can see, it's going to want to restart the device now. So I have to remember what my external host is, what my custom external signaling port is, which is going to be 9000. And we already know what the IP address is of the UCM, so with that information I can go ahead and start plugging this in. Now I'm in the Firewall Advanced Settings rule. I clicked on DNAT. I'm going to add my first rule here. Now I'm going to call this rule SIP to UCM. To make that look neat, add that there. We're going to enable this rule. IP family anywhere. Typically we're going to be using IVP4. I'm not really going to restrict that. So my source group on the GWN is going to be the WAN because that's where the traffic is coming into. My destination group is my local group, group 0. That's my default group. This is a default group that is available to you on the 7000. That's just my 100.1 group address. So 192.168.100.1. I know what that. I know that that's my destination group because that's where it's going to my UCM, and you can see that here. So I'm going to make that group 0. Protocols. Now SIP and our RTP is going over UDP. But if you have the option, enable both. Let's say you want to switch that in the future to a TCP signaling. You can do that. So I'm just going to keep it as is. But if you want to do this per protocol, it's predominantly going to be UDP unless you change it on our system. So source IP address, this is what we're going to be using for our whitelist. So I already have my whitelist addressed for my account here. I know it's this one. I'm going to go ahead and add this to my source list. So your source list you're going to have to be concerned with is who your VoIP provider is. So you can either add a single IP address in there, which for my Florida account they have 2 IP addresses to choose from. I know that the server that I'm currently using is this IP address, so I'm going to use that. You could use subnet notation as well, or slash notation where we do /24, and that will be accepted. So you can whitelist a whole range if needed. A lot of VoIP providers will have a range that you would want to whitelist. Next we have destination IP. Now the destination for the source group is going to be our public IP address here. So I want to make sure that I go ahead and get my public IP address. This is the public IP address of our router. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in here. I'm not going to worry about source port. Destination port, this is something I will have to worry about, because this is going to be our custom SIP signaling port, and this is what's going to allow you to open up that port on our public IP or on this router. So if anyone hits the destination port of 9000, we will rewrite the IP to be, or we're actually going to be rewriting our public IP to 192.168.100.103. This is the IP address of our UCM. Rewrite port. So I'm not going to use 9000 because I didn't change our default SIP signaling port. So I'm going to change our rewrite port to 5060. Now we don't have to worry about any schedule times or dates here. You could add time conditions if you want with our router, but we're not going to make anything too complicated here for you. I'm going to apply changes. So that's how we get ourselves taken care of with SIP. So not only did I go ahead and whitelist my provider's IP, I also created a custom rule or a custom SIP signaling port of 9000 for extra security. We're not using a default of 5060. So you will have to make sure that you make both endpoints and your provider aware of our custom SIP port. Now you won't have to do this if you're registering to your SIP provider, because once we exchange that information upon us trying to register, we will tell them what our external ports are, which is going to be 9000, so you won't have to worry about that in a registered scenario. But if you're peering with that host, that host will have to associate your registration to be your public IP, then :9000, which is your custom SIP signaling port. So be aware of that. This will also apply to phone registration as well. So if we have a remote phone trying to register to our PBX, you will have to include the public IP :9000, that custom SIP signaling port. So just to give you a quick demonstration on how we would register an endpoint that is trying to remotely register to your UCM that's behind a NAT. So as you can recall, we did make the custom SIP signaling port on your router 9000, which will translate locally to the UCM to its local IP and its local SIP signaling port of 5060. All you really got to do here is add : and the custom SIP signaling port of 9000, and that's it. So if you just have an IP address onto one of our phones, it knows inherently to signal off of 5060, but unless you specify otherwise, it will continue doing that. So by adding the :9000 here, it will now try to contact that SIP server on that public IP at :9000. Next, we're going to go ahead and do our RTP range. RTP, we're going to enable. Going to go through the same stuff. Source port is going to be WAN. Destination group is going to be group 0. Now, source IP, I could whitelist my VoIP provider, but there could be a good chance that they could be using a separate media server. So with RTP, I'm not too worried about the source port, because in order to have those ports even opened up, you will have to make a SIP connection first. So even though those ports are open, they're meaningless if you can't really make any connection to or through the session initiation protocol. So I'm not going to do that for now. Destination IP, if you guys remember, it's going to be our public destination port. This is where we're going to do the 10,000 through 20,000 range. So we're going to do 10,000, 3 through 20, 1, 2, 3, 20,000, rewrite IP. So we're technically rewriting our destination IP, which is our public, to our local of the UCM 100.103. Now, as you can see, if I do a range on the 7,000, it will automatically add that range below for us. I'll go ahead and save that change. Apply changes. Now, you will have to do port forwarding on a router of your choice. I highly recommend that you don't do this on a modem that may not have good security rules on this. I recommend that you always have a dedicated firewall that will help give you some level of security. But you know, as you saw earlier, our security came from us whitelisting the source address. So when I whitelisted my provider, it allowed us to make that connection possible. Going back to the UCM, I'm going to go ahead and log back in. And just to verify that everything's working right, as you can see, my VoIP trunk is being monitored in blue. Now, if that comes up as being unmonitored, it's as simple as going back to your VoIP trunk, editing that VoIP trunk. We're going to go to advanced settings and make sure you enable your heartbeat detection here. That will send notifications to your provider, checking to make sure that it is still there and reachable. And if you have that enabled, you will get that monitored status. But beyond that, that's NAT for you. Once we have completed on the PBX, the SIP settings, NAT rule, as long as all this information is correct, you won't have to worry about getting dropped after 30 seconds of making an outbound or an inbound call. Inbound call might not even work because you don't have either the port forwarding rule set or you don't have this properly stamped. Another thing I might like to add as well, if even after doing these steps you still have issues with one-way audio getting dropped after 30 seconds, you might want to check uncheck use IP and address and SDP. So you might want to uncheck that and save and apply those changes. It will reboot again, unfortunately. But that's usually my last to-go-to method in order to resolve that. If that doesn't work from here, I would highly recommend that you log into your router and you check for SIP ALG. Now, it's not always called ALG. It could be called SIP Helper, whatever your router manufacturer likes to call their application that helps you traverse NAT. The big issue with routers with SIP ALG is what it's really trying to do is it's trying to help establish these connections for you. When traversing NAT. The problem is either it works too well or sometimes it just will not work at all. So my recommendations is you always disable NAT. You always disable SIP ALG on your router before continuing with these steps. And once you have done everything, it should start working. But if you are still running into issues and you're still tearing out your hair and you don't know what's going on, and you come to the conclusion that you need to submit a ticket with us, the best thing that you can do before you submit that ticket If you're still running into these issues, we're going to go to maintenance, network troubleshooting here, and we want to make sure that we select the interface that we know our invites and our registration is going to be coming into. Because I have my router or my PBX in switch mode, I only have one interface, which is my LAN. I can go ahead and start that capture. I could leave it running for 10 minutes. That way we can see the registration attempts happening to your provider, as well as we can try placing a call. And once we make that call, we should see that call being placed in this network packet capture. Once you have ran your test call, you got the one-way audio reproduced, or you got the 30-second drop reproduced, you can go ahead, stop the capture, then download it. Once you have it downloaded, go ahead, submit this capture to the ticket, and just by looking at that information, we can tell you where you need to make the appropriate changes necessary to fix this issue. But beyond that, that's everything that you really need to know when it comes to configuring NAT on our PBX. I hope you found that this was very helpful. Feel free to like and subscribe to our channel just to get the latest and updated videos. We hope that you found that video tutorial helpful, and if you did, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for the latest in video tutorials. I'm Nathan Sharp. You have a good one.